All right, we have a number of visitors, and I have to tell you, the topic of the series that we're doing is difficult text of the Bible, and basically we've allowed the members here and visitors alike that want anonymously to put into our sermon suggestion box back there difficult passages or topics or things that they have questions about. And so this series on Wednesday nights has been answering those questions through using the Bible, of course, and to the best of our ability. Tonight's topic, it just so happens, it was the next question in line, and that is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Not the entirety of the subject, but just answering the question that is at hand, and that is a difficult passage. I say difficult in that it's one that just reading by itself and not using the proper context can really cause a lot of problems. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15, as well as verse 39. We have two questions, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer both. But knowing this subject and knowing this congregation, what wonderful discussion we always have, chances are we probably won't even get finished with the first question, but we'll do our best. 1 Corinthians 7:15, the question is, when the unbeliever departs and the situation for the believer is that he or she is not under bondage, does that mean that he or she has the right to remarry? Question number one. Question two is in verse 39. The widows that marry, they are to marry only in the Lord. And so the question is only in the Lord meaning they have to marry a Christian? Or does that have reference to something else? Those are our questions at hand. So 1 Corinthians 7, we're going to begin in verse number 1 in a moment. I want to preface this study recognizing that this is a very tender subject. I understand that each of us, and I want you to know right off the bat, as I'm talking about this subject and we talk about it straight from the Word of God, that I am as desirable as anyone in here. If there was any way that we could push some rules to the side and make exceptions, because I have a family member just like many of you do, that I wish that I could prove biblically that their marriage is acceptable to God. And I want you to know that, because I know that the mindset sometimes is, well, if he or if she had this situation, she wouldn't be so strict on it or something to that effect. And I don't want you to think of it that way. All I want to do with this subject, as with any subject, is simply see what the Bible says. And I want you to know that I've studied this and you've studied this, and together I believe the Bible, and we'll see clearly, hopefully tonight, that the Bible is very plain on the topic, even in 1 Corinthians 7. Very interesting series of verses here. Let's begin in verse 1. And as I want to encourage discussion and questions, of course, comments as we go through this, and certainly don't want to offend or upset anyone. Let's certainly be mindful, but let's certainly not by any means compromise the truth of the matter. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me. By the way, the reason I'm starting in verse 1 is why. Our question comes in verse 15, but why do we start in verse 1? Staying in the context, right? I've said that just about every week, but that's what we're doing. We want to see the context, and that's going to help us so much. Concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me. All right, very quickly, pause there. The book of 1 Corinthians is from chapter about 4 on, is a series of questions that Paul answers. The book should have ended around chapter 3, chapter 4, but it didn't, because the household of Stephanus and of Chloe, you recall, gave him or sent him some questions. And so he decides to take the rest of that letter, and each chapter is divided and devoted to the question that Paul's answering. Right? Chapter 5 is about taking your brethren to court. They had questions about that, so chapter 5 he answers that. Right? Not chapter 5, excuse me. Chapter 5 is the man caught in adultery. Chapter 6 is about taking your brethren to court. Chapter 7, marriage, and the questions we're going to see. Chapter 8, meat offered to idols. Chapter 9, authority. Chapter 10, it just goes on and on. You get into the spiritual gifts and you go through. And so chapter 7, he's addressing questions that he was sent. Now we don't know what those questions were, but we can get a pretty good idea based upon what he's going to say. So chapter 7 verse 1, he says, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me. Okay, regarding this subject. It is good for a man not to touch, King James Version, a woman. Adults, what does that mean? What's he referencing there when he says it's good for a man not to touch? Is he talking about don't poke her on the shoulder? No, what's he mean there? Right, we're talking about a sexual thing here, physical relations, right? It's good for a man not to have sexual relations, physical relationships with a woman. In particular, he's talking about, of course, here out of wedlock. Verse 2, nevertheless, and here's how we know why, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Right? To avoid that sin of premarital relationship, fornication outside of marriage, he says you can solve that by being married. Have a husband, have a wife, and enjoy that within the marriage relationship. Simple enough. Verse 3. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, affection. Women need that, right? And likewise the wife unto the husband. There's an affection that is very important there. The wife hath not power over her own body. I want you to remember this verse. The wife does not have power over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. Each spouse is in power over, the way it's worded, the body of their spouse. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Verse 5. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time. Still talking about the context here of that physical relationship. Don't defraud one another of that, unless you consent to do so for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. What does he mean there? That if you do not share that relationship in your marriage, that in time you're going to be tempted by Satan for your incontinency. What does that mean?
Self-control.
Yeah, your self-control, right?
That's the way it is in the New King James.
That's right. Well, that's the idea. When you go so far, we're programmed to desire that as adults, right? Men especially are programmed. Well, I say that I'm a man, and so I say that men especially are. Women are too, don't get me wrong. And so we need to share that together. And when we don't, we may be more tempted towards those that are outside. And adultery might be more tempting when that's not happening at home. You understand what we're talking about. Verse 6, key verse. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Very, very critical verse. Because understanding what Paul meant when he said that really helps to clarify what we're talking about. And the easiest way to understand it is simply to just look at the context. Look at what he says in verse 7. For I would that all men were even as I myself. Right? What is he doing in verse 7? When he says, I would that all men, what's he doing? Suggesting.
I would like that all men were like me.
Exactly. Is this a command? What does he mean, by the way, be like me? Not married. Not married. His example, he's not a married man. He says, I would, and we're going to notice that there's a present distress a little later, verse 26 or so, but he said, I would that you don't get married, that you are like me. Is that a command? Does the Lord tell us we cannot get married? No. So he's speaking of permission and not of commandment. What does permission or concession mean there then, based on the context? Is he denying inspiration here, as some would suggest? Is he saying that he's not inspired in his writing? No. He's saying that what I'm telling you isn't a commandment, it's a what? It's an inspired suggestion. It's my inspired advice given the current matter. That's what we're doing, or that's what he's doing rather. Verse 7. So he says that the things I'm telling you are by concession and not of commandment. You're going to notice that most of this chapter, not all of it, but most of this chapter fits into that concession category because he's going to tell you again and again. We'll note that as we go along. Verse 7, let's continue. Every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. I say therefore, to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. If you didn't know that Paul was single, if you're just reading through this, it begins to make sense in verse 8 because he says it. Those that are unmarried and those that are widows, abide as I. Don't be married right now. Stay as you are. Verse 9. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Right? What does he mean there? It's better for you to marry than to burn. Burn with what? Are you talking about hell there? No, he's talking about what? Desiring the flesh, burning with passion, with great desire. It's better for you to marry than to just lust after each other like that and end up doing things you ought not. We see that a lot, don't we? With our young people, and we've been there. We know what it's like to date and to be engaged and to be in love, and you're not married yet, and you know you're going to be, and it's tempting, and we know what that's like. And young people are facing that in the world every day. And so verse 9, if they can't contain, Paul says, let them marry. It's better to marry than to sin. It's better to marry than to just burn with passion for one another. Or if you're not going to get married and you're not in that position, it may be better just to avoid that relationship if it's not a godly one. But verse 10, let's stay with the context. Verse 10, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Knowing what we just read, verse 10 and that statement makes a lot of sense. Right? Some argue, and I get it, I get the point. Some say, well, this means that Jesus taught it when He was here on earth. And that's certainly logical, certainly makes sense, and it did, well, arguably He did in this case, but based on the context of what He said in verse 6, what is He doing in verse 10? Because in verses 6 through 9, He's speaking of concession, and so what does He want to make sure we understand about verse 10 through 12? These are commands. This is not a suggestion. I'm not giving you advice when I say this, right? That's the context. That's what's happening. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, okay? The Lord now is commanding this. This is not a suggestion. He never let go of inspiration, but He gave a suggestion or inspired advice, and now He's giving a command. Here's that command. Let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, I said through 12, verses 10 and 11 I meant. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. All right? We're gonna talk about this in a moment. Verse 12. Let's finish through verse 15, and then we'll talk about it. Verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. He's back to permission here. This is inspired suggestion. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let her not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. All right, let's talk about some key words here, and we'll explain in verses 10 through 15 a little better together, not just me, but with you as well. 3 words that I want you to remember. In order to get what's going on in 1 Corinthians 7, you just got to dive into the language. You really do, because this is a very difficult section of Scripture, and I say it's difficult in the same sense that Peter said some things Paul wrote were difficult or hard, because it can easily be misunderstood and construed. And we're talking about something that is very important, because if we do this wrong and not according to God's will, we got to answer for that. And so we need to know what he means. There's no doubt. We can't be playing this like it's a game and just do what I want and not really worry about what it means. We need to know what he means here and what he's talking about, and I believe we can. 3 key words I want you to remember. Number 1, the word apoluo. Apoluo. That is the Greek word for divorce. This is based upon Strong's. Exhaustive. You guys, most of you probably, if you use something, you use Strong's, maybe Thayer's, maybe Vine's. But Strong's is what I'm using for these definitions. Apoluo, to put away, to divorce. That is the word used in Matthew 19, in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus says, or describes that idea of putting away. Right? If you put her away and marry another, you committeth adultery. You commit adultery. You remember that text? You know that idea. That's apoluo. Now that's important, because that word is never used in 1 Corinthians 7. And that comes as a surprise to most people, because as you read through this, we a lot of times just assume that we're talking about divorce. And we're going to get to the arguments. We're going to dissect it in a minute. But before we do, I want to show you the 2 words that are used and why this is important. 2 words are used throughout this chapter. The first one is pronounced aphiemi. Aphiemi. And it is a word that means, based upon Strong's, to send or to go. If you're talking about the husband to the wife, you're sending her. If the wife is leaving, then you're talking about her going, to go or to send. That's what the word means. Chorizo, the other word, you probably, maybe if you've studied any Greek at all, you know this word. Chorizo is to place room between or to separate. Strong's, to separate. These are the 2 words that are used in chapter 7. It's very interesting to me that the Holy Spirit did not use apoluo in chapter 7. Why is that significant? Why is that important? Because it's possible, listen to me, it's possible that he's not addressing divorce here. that he's addressing separation. Right? Isn't there, even in today's society, we understand, and it's always been this way, there's a difference between a separation and a divorce, right? And that's very important. And so we need to know which one he's talking about. And for beginners, apoluo is never mentioned. Let's go back up to verse 10. Verse 10, verse 12, and verse 25, because I want you to see again this idea of what is permission and what is command. Verse 10, he says, I'm speaking by command. Okay, yet not I, but the Lord. So verses 10 and 11 are commands from the Lord. All right, and we're going to read it and dissect it in a moment. Verse 12, he goes back to I speaking and not the Lord. Now again, some would say that just means the Lord did not address this when he was on earth. And again, that's certainly a rational and logical conclusion. I don't necessarily just am so arrogant to say that there's no way that's what's going on. But as I'm reading through this, and as you're reading through this, in this context, you see Paul already make a statement that I'm speaking by inspired suggestion here, not by commandment. This is my inspired opinion on the matter. And so he jumps back to that, it appears in verse 12. If that's not enough, look at verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my what? Judgment. If that's not plainer than any of them, then I don't know what is. That's as plain as it gets. I don't have a commandment of the Lord. I'm giving you my judgment on the matter. And then he says in verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. He's going to continue to say, don't marry. If you're married, stay that way. If you're unmarried, stay that way. Because of the present distress, whatever that might be. Some say it's persecution. Who knows? We don't know for sure what that is. But in the present distress, his opinion was don't change your marital status, whatever it is. To do so is not to violate God's will, but it's to not heed to the advice of Paul. It's not necessarily sinful, but it's his inspired opinion, okay? So you see those verses, again, just looking at the greater context. So let's look at verses 10 and 11. Let's get into this. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away or aphiemi, send away his wife. Let's talk about both sides of the fence. Let's say that this is talking about divorce. What here seems to give evidence that it might be divorce and not separation that we're addressing? Unmarried. Excellent. He says there, let her remain unmarried. And so it seems as though she's not married, so that would have to be divorce. That's one side of this argument. Now, look on the other side, though. What seems to give evidence that he could be talking about, and this is why this is difficult, that he might be talking about separation and not divorce? Do you see a key word there that also throws you in that direction? That's right. She's still, or he still called her what? Husband. They're still husband. Now, you can debate on both sides. Well, he could have referenced unmarried. On this side, you could say, well, he meant unmarried to another. He's supposed to remain unmarried in that sense, or be reconciled to her husband. And then you can go on this side, and you can argue, well, the word there for husband is just the word for man, and so right? It's a difficult, it's a tough situation. But the Greek word here is not epoluo, and it's very significant, I believe. It is this idea of aphiemi, or the idea of separation. And so what he says there, let not the wife depart from her husband, but and if she does, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. If that is divorce, what is Paul teaching? Let's say that it's divorce for a moment. What is the teaching that Paul's giving in verses 10 and 11 if we assume that it's divorce? What would he be saying here? Okay, good. In other words, you can divorce, and the only person you can remarry would be who? Your original spouse. You would have to go, if you depart, you may go back and remarry your original spouse. Right? Does that contradict anything that our Lord taught? Is there any issues with that particular conclusion? It does violate the Old Testament.
When it talks about in the Old Testament divorcing, going to marry someone else, and you can't go back to the original.
Yes. That's true. Under the Old Testament, that's exactly right. Now, in verse 11 here, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Let's say that this is talking about separation. What would Paul then be saying here? What would his point be? If you separate, what are the rules?
Not free to be remarried.
You're not free to be remarried, but you certainly can be reconciled with your husband. You can just come back to him. The word reconciled is the word that you would think it is, the idea of forgiveness there, the idea of joining back. And so it is. It's a very difficult section. It would be nice to know, now don't misunderstand me, I'm not trying to say God left us hanging here, but it would be easier on us if we knew what their question was. Some say that this is about abuse, that the spouse was getting hit, getting beat, and so God gives a new reason that you can divorce if there is abuse. Well, maybe that was the question, but we don't know that. So for us to just jump in and say, hey, if you've got abuse, you can divorce and remarry scripturally, or you can divorce in this particular passage, that's a huge leap because we don't know what their question was. We don't know that it was about abuse. But you see what can happen. This verse gets taken and used to give authority that is a bit of a leap, at least in my opinion. Carlos, did you have your hand up? Oh, Susan did. I saw somebody over here.
Okay, so in the verses 10 and 11,
yes.
where it says, let her remain unmarried, are you saying that that's the ephemy?
No, the put away is aphiemi. The word unmarried
Okay.
is simply just that. It just means unmarried.
Okay, so then
Yeah.
my question is there another term for unmarried? Because I'm thinking if unmarried also means remain separated, then that clears it up too. Because if they remain separated, then the reconciliation is there also, but not to put confusion in there.
Exactly. Yeah, that word unmarried, and it's not, I have not found, and somebody correct me if you have, but I have never found a different word that Paul could have used there, because that would help us. If there was another word where Paul would describe someone that was in a marriage, and he would have called them by a different Greek term, then we would know, okay, Paul didn't use that term, he used this one. But this term here for unmarried, he could be referencing, it could be used either way. It could be a reference to the fact that she is literally unmarried completely, or the implication could be the necessary inference that she's not to marry another. If they understood this as separation, and if I said to you and you knew I was talking about separation, right? If she departs, or separates, you need to remain unmarried. You'd know what I meant by that. You can't marry somebody else. But we don't know. I don't know of another word that he could have used there. But that's a great question. Any other thoughts on these particular two verses? I know these are not our verses at hand, but these are in the context of verse 15, and it will help us when we get to verse 15 to get a better grasp of what's going on in these four verses before it.
Keep the same context. How does that relate to verses 12 and 13?
Okay, good. How does this relate to verse 12 and 13 is an excellent question, because I think we're going to see that that's going to help clear it up even more. So let's get to it. Verse 12 and 13, we're continuing to use the same words, chorizo, aphiemi. Same words are being used. But to the rest, now the rest is apparently others who were asking questions about this marriage as well, a believer and unbeliever situation. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, so you've got a believer who is married to an unbeliever, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let her not put her away. That's not apoluo. That's the aphiemi or chorizo. I forget which one's which, but they're used interchangeably through here in the same context. Verse 13, the woman which hath not an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. That word is aphiemi there. I know that for a fact. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. So in verses 12 through 14, it's a slightly different situation, but it's the same topic. Whatever he's talking about in 10 and 11, divorce or separation, he's talking about it there in 12 and 13 as well. But the question now is, it's told what it is. The question's about a believer and unbeliever this time. All right? So if a believer is married to an unbeliever and she wants to leave him, whether you want to call that divorce or separation, if she does that, what is the rule here? Right? He's encouraging them to do it. Of course, we didn't read verse 15. You know what it says. If she does depart, the unbeliever, what does he say? Let him or let her depart. All right? That's very critical. Because if this is divorce, what just happened? If this is divorce, and he tells them, if the unbeliever divorces, you let her. What does that tell you, Jim? What issue arises?
Well, they would be giving permission to divorce for being an unbeliever. Is that what?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. In other words, this would be permission, and this is why this is a good question. Because that would mean that an unbeliever has the right to divorce a believer, or the believer has a right to divorce the unbeliever, right?
Against Matthew 19:9.
Right, that contradicts Matthew 19:9. Next Tuesday, we're going to be talking about Bible inspiration, and the next, we're going to talk about contradictions, alleged contradictions, and what constitutes a contradiction and what does not, right? If I tell you that Sandy Bennett was at Walmart buying groceries, and then I'm writing another letter later, and I say to you, Larry Paulk was at Walmart buying groceries at the same time. Is that a contradiction? No, because it's possible that both of them were there at the same time. That's not a contradiction. Why does that matter? Because when you see the Lord say, the only exception that there is for divorce and remarriage, not my words now, the Lord's in Matthew 19:9, when He says that, this is the only exception, and then Paul says, here's another exception, is that a contradiction? Do you see the difference? That would be a contradiction. But for me, there is no contradiction because he's not using the language that Jesus used. This is not about apoluo. This is about separation. It seems logical that they would want to know, just like we would. It's not divorce, it's separation. So what do we do about that, Lord? We're not divorced. We're not violating Matthew 19, but can we be separated? Now, I told you to remember verse 4. I want to go back to it for a minute. Here's why I said that. If Paul just told you, and he did, and at least as you're reading this letter, put yourself in their shoes. If Paul just told you that you have a requirement to give due affection to your wife and her to you, and that you're in control over one another's bodies, and then you find out that there is this idea that we can separate, what question might come to mind? What might you ask? I have a responsibility when I'm married to provide for my spouse physically. But then you've got this question of separation, and so what are they going to ask, naturally? Well, you just told me that if I'm married, I've got to provide physically. So when you get to verse 15, he says, a brother or sister, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. We're going to talk about that word in a minute. But let's just say for a moment, you don't dive into this Greek at all, and you just think about if there's anything about a marriage that could even remotely be close to being called slavery, and it's never talked about that way. But if you could talk about it that way, what is the only thing in which, or description the Bible gives, that would kind of give a hint that one has power over another? That one is the master or lord of the other? We just read it. That verse 4, right? Who has power? I'm married to Amber. I have a beautiful wife, and I'll always believe that, regardless of whether you do or not, but you do too, because she's beautiful. But I have a beautiful spouse, and I have power over her body. What does that mean? I'm not talking about details now. I'm talking about what does it mean that I have power? There's a reason this is an adult. Why is it that I have power? What does that mean, the word power? Exousia. What does that word mean?
Like prerogative, privilege.
Expectation.
Okay, all of those are true. All of those are true. When Jesus says all power is given to me, the word is used there. What does that word mean? All authority. That's the word I'm looking for. I think that's what you said, isn't it, Bill? Authority, right? In other words, He is He is over. He is in control of. He is. So if there's anything that we're in bondage to our spouse about, it is that physical relationship that he just addressed. And that would certainly make sense at the end of verse 15 when he says, but God hath called us to peace. What's a relationship like when you're not getting along and you're just going to try to enjoy the physical relationship anyways? Is that going to be peaceable? No. Not even close. But let me throw a wrench in this. Let's go a little deeper though, and I'll tell you something I find very interesting. This word bondage, apparently, I'm not a Greek scholar, I don't pretend to be, but this word bondage is in the present tense. And what that means is that, and I've got this up here for you to see. What did I say? Not present, perfect Present tense means continuous action. Perfect tense. Perfect tense, and what that means is, it's something that happened in the past that's already been completed that has present results. Okay, that's what perfect tense always means in the Greek. It's a very neat language because words and the way they're put together, it's much better than English. It's very easy to understand what's going on just by the way a word is put together. It's done in the past with present results. In other words, what he's saying here is, was not and still is not bound. And when I studied this further and discovered that, I realized that this isn't even talking about the marriage. Because he's saying you never were bound, and you're still not bound in such cases. Now that being the case, he can't be talking about the marriage, because certainly you were bound to the marriage before. So what might he be talking about? What could he possibly be referencing that were not bound and are still not bound to do what in such cases? What might happen when you have a believer and unbeliever fighting, and the unbeliever gives you that ultimatum, and he or she, the unbeliever, says to the believing spouse, you've got to choose God or me. I'm tired of this. It's about to be over. You've got a decision to make. What have you got to do? What are you not under bondage to do in such cases?
Start packing.
You're not under bondage to, in any case, to do what? Deny the Lord. To choose your spouse over the Lord. Right? Now, I'm not trying to pretend like at 28 years old I know all about this, I've got all the answers, but here's some food for thought. Even if this is referencing the marriage, I believe it would apply to the bondage he described, not to... Here's what I'm getting at. You can't take verse 15 and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Paul is teaching that you can divorce and remarry if you divorce an unbeliever. You just can't get that from verse 15. And to do so is to walk on very dangerous territory because we're doing something that's not in faith. Romans 14:23. All right, you with me? Let's take some discussion. Jim?
Well, that particular verse, to me, the bondage is your husband and wife. The bondage is that even if your spouse is a non-believer, you have an obligation to be a husband or wife to that person.
Yes.
But if that person leaves, and you've chosen God, to put that stipulation, choose me or God, if that person leaves, you've got no obligation to be a husband or a wife because they're gone.
You're exactly right. Absolutely.
It's not a divorce, but you can't be a husband or wife to a person that's separated or gone.
Right. So Jim's kind of talking along those same lines. When that separation is there, you can't be that husband or that wife that you need to be because you're not together right now. You can't do your part as a spouse. By the way, on that note, we didn't even mention verse 16. In the verses before that, he just talked about making them clean. What was he referencing? If you stick it out and continue to be a good example, they might just become a what? A Christian. But then he gets to verse 16 and says, if she does leave you, whether you want to view it as that ultimatum or not, if it happens, he says, for what knowest thou? Let them depart. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or what knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So he says, in that case, you don't even know that you would have ever converted her. Don't feel like you've ruined it, that it's your fault, that it's all over, and that you're going to, you've got to dwell on this and be anxious about this. And he says, you don't know that you would have ever converted her, or that she would have, you're kidding me, or she would have ever converted you. We just started, didn't we? Some other thoughts, Mr. McDaniel?
Does sanctified mean in this, where they're both sanctified?
Yes.
Talk about the children
Yes.
being
Holy, yes.
What is sanctified?
Great question. What is it? What is the word, first of all, what does the word sanctified mean? Set apart. Yeah, set apart. And you know that. Set apart. And so what he's getting at here, and again, if you didn't know it, you'd see it there in verse 16. But what he's getting at here is in staying together and working together, if she be pleased to dwell with you, don't put her away, and vice versa. For the unbelieving husband the unbeliever is sanctified by the wife. Does that mean that person is a Christian, regardless of whether they do what God says? No. But what is he implying? And what would they have understood that, of course, to mean? They're blessed. That's true. Absolutely. They're blessed. And you can couple this with 1 Peter 3:1. It's like the wife, she needs to obey and be a good example for her husband. so that what might happen? Might become a Christian. Might become a Christian. By the way, on another side note, the question that they're asking would certainly make sense, because when you talk about being married to an unbeliever, and we're going to get into this, I guess, next week. We're not going to get into it tonight, but when you talk about being in a hard, a difficult marriage like that, when you're married to someone that's not a Christian, and you're dealing with that, it certainly makes sense why they would ask, Paul, what do I do about this? We're struggling. My children are growing up seeing this. What are we going to do? And that's a tough situation. And so Paul answers that by inspiration and gives his inspired judgment on the matter and describes that not being under bondage there in verse 15. But another, yes, sir, Mr. McDaniel.
When you talk about the child being holy, in other words, one of the two are Christian, which makes the child holy. And so if two people come together who aren't Christian and have a child, what does that make the child?
Well, I think the holy there is not saying that they are automatically holy because one of the parents are righteous or because one of the parents are holy, but that the hope is that the righteous parent can lead that child up to still become holy, even with that difficult situation. So if you've got two unrighteous parents, then that child doesn't have a chance of being holy at all. And so Paul wouldn't even call that holy, but unless one of the parents obeyed the gospel or the child did, and then, of course, that child would be holy. I saw a hand back here, I think. Jim? Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, good. Well, that's awesome. We're on the same page tonight. I like it. We normally are, aren't we? Stan, do you have a thought?
The idea is that it would be a good example for the children, and therefore they would be in a blessed situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
A holy situation that God approves of.
Absolutely.
Now, He doesn't approve of fighting and bickering and carrying on, but the example that the believing spouse would have would be the example that would make that child holy, that would make the situation holy.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Very good thought. Very good thought. Anybody else? I know our time is almost up. Carlos?
And this will probably be a discussion for next week, but I think we have to also look at how what we're talking about now is how we have to introduce the word remedy in it. That's where people take illogical steps to think that because one condition prevails, and that is Paul says he doesn't want, you don't have to be in all this confusion. The whole thing is about being a Christian. And so whatever that implies, it doesn't imply a remedy for somebody who's not eligible to marry.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't remediate. There's nothing here to remedy.
Yeah.
When people make decisions about what else to do with their lives, it's not because it flows logically from this situation. It's just a separate decision that they make, that they create a remedy in their mind where there was really not a problem.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And you're right. We've got to. That was a second bell. I'm so sorry. I've got multiple hands that we just don't have time. I'm so sorry.
The thing is that the congregation, the church in Corinth, had a lot of problems.
Yes.
This was one of them, and he's trying to deal with that problem.
Right.
in
Yes.
his letter,
It is.
in this part of it, but they had multiple problems
It is.
that he had to deal with, and he had his hands full.
He did, absolutely. Please hold your thoughts. Next week, we will pick up where we left off. Please know that all I want you to get out of this for tonight is that you've got to be sure before you try to get something out of this that would give you permission to remarry for another reason. And those, I just don't think we can be sure that this gives us authority to do that. I'll always tell you to play it safe unless you can be positively sure. And there's so much evidence to suggest otherwise. And we cannot allow these things to contradict what Jesus said either. So let's pick up where we left off. I'm so sorry, Jim. I'm so sorry. Let's pick up where we left off. Next week our time is way over, and I've got to stop. God bless you, and we'll pick up next time.